You started off talking a bit about the idea of institutional transformation or transformative institutional work being the more important or more, I guess, the main part of the work that you do. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, I guess, what strategies, what's worked in terms of trying to impact the rest of the campus or enact institutional transformation, I guess, through the interdisciplinary work. Because at another point you sort of mentioned a kind of exercise in non-communication. And so how do you get some people together who speak totally different languages or who may not be able to communicate in the ways that we're accustomed in, you know, the university, and get them to be engaged?
I suppose I learned how to, you know, kind of negotiate different languages. I'm a terrible linguist, literally, but, you know, different idiolects or whatever. By working in art schools, or, you know, first of all, you know, I started working in art schools when I was in my early 20s, when I went straight from the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, teaching stuff like general studies and complementary studies and stuff that they didn't really want to do because they went to art school to do art, but 40% of their time and credits came from, you know, learning how to be citizens and have a basic education. And so there was immediately this challenge of how do you communicate with people who are not particularly interested in what you've got to say, probably, and who themselves often, I mean, art students at that time, there tended to be a culture of, you know, it was organised around suspicion of academic knowledge, over-organised syntax, a kind of allergy to fluency, and dyslexia was rampant, and that's how you define yourself as an art student. But that's a generalisation, because, you know, if you're dealing with, in an arts environment like Cal Arts, you're also dealing with musicians and theatre people, and musicians, some of the electronic composers arrive with, you know, PhDs in philosophy, you know, and mathematics. So that was the other thing, you know, you're not just dealing with people, a large group of people who are very suspicious of organised thought, as it were, that isn't, you know, I mean, there's different kinds of forms of coherence, rigour and organisation in artwork, but it's not, you know, it's not reducible to language. That's the whole point. You know, it can't be described in a sense, but it, you know, it can be. You can nonetheless specify the criteria for rigour in art production. But then, you know, in an arts college like Cal Arts, you've got all these different forms of expertise, different languages, different different histories, different levels of development. For instance, at Cal Arts, people were admitted on the basis of their artistic excellence, so, you know, on the basis of their portfolio or their audition as dancers or whatever, with no reference whatsoever to their academic competence. So then, you know, you just have to respond to the teaching situation as if you were in church. You know, it was a church. Anybody who walked in the door had a right to an education, which meant that you had to develop, you know, these charismatic sort of snake oil salesman techniques to keep people interested. But that also, I mean, I always felt, as far as the students are concerned, it always involved using, you know, what were then, you know, when I started, cutting edge technologies like slides, audio tape, and you know, and incorporating that with gesture, and you know, theatre kind of thing. So it became a kind of performance art, just to get people's attention and show them that, you know, knowledge could be generated across different formats, different platforms, in a way that was artful, in a sense. I guess that's what. So that was how it worked, with how I developed a certain approach to working as a teacher. And I myself found that more congenial than, you know, always having to refer to the canonical texts and interpreting. I always regarded what I was doing as coming out of more of a tradition of interruption from the arts side than interpretation. It doesn't mean I hate interpretation. It's just that I don't think it's necessary but not sufficient as a way of provoking people to think for themselves, which in the end is the important thing with artists. They may not be autonomous, but they have to be capable of unprompted first-hand judgment. They have to take responsibility for materializing ideas. And that means they have to become sovereign at some level, even when they're, kind of extremely callow and unformed. That was one thing. But then when it came to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Centre, where the word interdisciplinary, I think, was somewhat moot by the time I arrived, there was a sort of certain caucus of people who tended to define the agenda, and it was really, really good for those people who were comfortable with this rather quiescent kind of view of interdisciplinarity, where the historians will be able to talk to the classicists and the English people in the English department. But all these outsiders, particularly young people, younger faculty who were trained in more interdisciplinary subjects and approaches, like cultural studies, couldn't find a way in. So, the mission then was to try to create contexts in which people were able to feel comfortable to leave behind their expertise and kind of learn other languages, other approaches, way outside their field of competence or training. And it's partly being able to float in that kind of environment without either, kind of collapsing entropically into a meltdown, I don't know what I'm doing, or becoming lazy and lazily eclectic. It's that thing, I think, of retaining your own disciplinary base and your own, your own ingrained kind of methodologies and bullshit filters and all that, but also being credulous enough to learn from and be taken in new directions, carried off, as it were, by other disciplines, other questions. So that's really where I think we need to go to create those environments where that kind of experimental laboratory ethos, or whatever it is, can be installed without people feeling insecure or being jeopardized when it comes to tenure review for deserting their department.
The question I had in your essay, you mentioned the big T,
Right.
referring to theory,
Right.
in art, I guess in art schools. I'm wondering, could you comment on that? And you said that the big T was part of the problem. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that. And I guess that was a reference to art schools or to artists in general.
Well, I was very aware that, in Britain in the 80s, a certain kind of theoreticism came in as an antidote to what people saw as sort of knee-jerk expressionism. The idea that the artist is a unique individual. They just work out themselves. There's no real way in which they're mediating the culture around them. There's no way in which it connects to larger questions. It's always some individualist venture. And so, theoreticism kind of got imported from the humanities and social sciences into the art schools as a way of countering that. And that grew out partly of, some valid changes in the art school faculty body, as feminist artists came in, and there was an interest in psychoanalysis and so on. And I have no complaint with that, except when it comes down to creating curricula which are kind of garbled accounts of really, really difficult, I think, French philosophy or critical theory, given without any real background, often aquaplaning off the latest essay in Art Forum. So there's this instrumentalization of critical theory, which I think is problematic, and you find students in critique, and of course critique is the point where the artist, the young artist, has to stand by and stand up for the work. When it's being scrutinized, that means it's under attack, because people want to make sure that, you know, it's substantial and substantive. And at that point, increasingly, students would start citing Lacan, Baudrillard, Deleuze particularly, and you know, and if they were good at it, then, you know, faculty would back off, because at least they said something. But often what they were saying, I don't think had any intrinsic relation to the work, and it can often be used, not always, but particularly in an honours undergraduate situation, or even an MFA, as a prop for weak work. And, you know, so I'd say, oh yeah, forget that. You know, it's all. So I would always talk about knee-jerk theoreticism being just as bogus as knee-jerk, you know, expressionism. Neither of them need to be cycled through an actually functioning individual mind. So I've never really been one for teaching theory to art students. I think the kind of, I prefer Barth's theory of theory, you know, as thought acting back on itself. So I'm just more interested in reflexive thinking, people who can pay attention to all the contingencies surrounding the work, have, you know, can stand up for the style and the materials they've chosen. So that I'm more interested in concretized thought. It doesn't have to be directed from above by, you know, deference to the Holy French theorists, or the German theorists, or even the British theorists. You know, it's like it all get in the way. That doesn't mean I'm anti-theory. But I think the articulation of theory to art practice has got particularly problematic, and it's to do with this credentialing of art, as if to get a PhD in art practice now is going to guarantee you anything but an opportunity to probably go on teaching and perpetuating the same approach in other institutions. It's certainly not going to get you an exhibition or recognition or a commission, you know.
Yeah, I think definitely your sort of endeavor to undermine the art practice theoretical divide speaks very strongly to me. But at the same time, I was wondering whether or not there's also a reinforcement of the divide and institutionalization of art practice as well. The fact in which, the ways in which, you know, art practice can become institutionalized, in the ways in which we teach art or even practice art in an institutional setting. This is sort of I'm speaking of the romantic idea of the artist, individual, you know, on its own, didactic, you know, self-teaching individual. But also I'd like also to point out in the sense that I agree with you, we shouldn't use theory as a device or hermeneutic device to understand art, that art in many ways contains its own hermeneutic processes in itself, and getting people to be more aware of that instead of using theory as a grid to apply to it. In the same way, theory in itself can become performative as well. It becomes a form of art as much as art is a form of theory itself. But I want to ask you, in your sort of cross-Atlantic divide or cross-Atlantic crossing, when you came over to the US and you speak of how it is hard to get funding for the art projects themselves, and I want to speak particularly to the container project, which is something I also played with myself for years now, because there are various people providing containers, recycled containers, to build homes. And it seems that the ways I looked at the site before your talk, and I found it interesting the sort of artistic twist you brought to the container project, more sort of a canvas than actually a strictly practical, you know, device to provide housing. And I wanted to know if in the architect you sort of contacted through that project, if there wasn't sort of a meeting ground in regards to the ways in which the container could become a canvas, but also as a practical device for housing as well, and the ways in which this evolved potentially now.
Right. Well, that is, as I said, we're not architects or even designers. You know, Kim is an incredibly driven and ingenious sculptor, and she's learning all this stuff and teaching students how to weld and all that stuff on the run. So, you know, in a sense, the artiness of what we came up with was a product of our own limitations in expertise. But when we opened up the competition, you know, the national, international competition, that was when we wanted to leverage all that into a more practical, functional iteration. And that's really what the donor wanted too. And we wanted it, we just didn't know how to do it. So we're prepared to learn now that the, you know, the commission has been given to a local Santa Barbara architectural firm. Our students will be working alongside these people to learn another set of skills which are, you know, are more practically useful. But I think Rural Studio is a great program, a great model for this, and what they're doing in design build programs, where they put together contractors and architects. And if you think there's a caste system, you know, in any profession, you know, think of that one. You know, contractors and architects never get on because they're never trained together. But you know, working together on these, you know, scavenge architecture projects, they're trying to create an alliance and a set of organic understandings of each other's disciplines. So yeah, I mean, that's why the real world thing, it's an educational challenge for all of us. I mean, it's not as if we have all those skills. We need to acquire skills. And that's another thing I think about the, you know, this kind of emphasis on the public face of what we're doing on partnership, is that you go into any of these conversations to learn, not to instruct, dictate, or talk down to. I mean, so I have to say one of the issues for our students is that, you know, a lot of the art students resist this notion of that they're kind of social workers in disguise, and so that's been an issue for Kim too. How do you keep people coming back for these classes, particularly as they've been running for years now? Usually, you know, in the UC system, you get credit for doing one class over 10 weeks. She's had students who've been working on these projects for a year and a half, and it's difficult to get it credited, it's difficult to get it organised, it's difficult to get the dean to sign off on it, it's difficult to keep up the momentum, but it's also difficult to secure the students' commitment when they still want to do their own work. That's why they want to be artists, you know, they want to actually spin stuff out of their own obsessions. So this is how I think Kim's really great at this, how she got around this. She had a show called Useless or Useless, again using the overall aesthetic and ethos of sustainability and recycling. And again, students were given a small amount of money to go to a store that sells remaindered industrial goods and stuff that's been salvaged, and make artwork out of corks and popcorn or whatever, you know, and discarded wood. And she's got the Edward Heller Gallery, which is the only contemporary gallery in Santa Barbara that's really interesting, to host this undergraduate show, you know, to put on this undergraduate show on first night, which is a first Thursday of the month. And the thing opened, and the pieces were really beautiful, but they also conformed to this consistent ethos, you know, and aesthetic that she's trying to develop. And every piece sold the first night. So for undergraduates, this was like the most inspiring recruitment kind of thing that they could have. You know, everyone had a red spot, every single one of them. Nothing sold for more than $900, but $900 to a student is, you know, that's a lot of money. So she is doing what she can to really help the students become fully paid up members of the precariat.
Can I suggest that we maybe just have a couple more...
Okay, and then break and then come back for the other thing. Okay, good.
I was, you know, this different type of arts pedagogy of disruption that it seems like as an institution, the UCIRA has picked that up in a lot of ways as a way of moving forward institutionally. But I was curious about this kind of mission statement, part of the mission statement that it has of arts advocacy and kind of intervening in public policy for this particular meeting, and just kind of what are some of the means by which UCIRA as an institution has tried to move ahead with that, and what are some of the types of interventions besides gaining visibility that the group has tried to forge?
Well, the advocacy, I guess, okay, we're deeply contradictory and incoherent in our mission, and in fact we've just gone through a period of reviewing our awards criteria, because we came up with these notions, action, research, demonstration project 3 years ago. And we got the board to have a retreat and look at these, because we were continually trying to squash more conventional art projects into these categories. And, it was like I was saying about the students, faculty were feeling constrained to translate what they were really doing into a language that made sense according to the sort of civic virtues that we were promoting. So we're going to actually retire these as grant categories, action research. Because that was, we're reserving up to $25,000 just for one action research project, and collaboration the same. So now we want action research and collaboration to be backgrounded, but they're always there as, as criteria to consider. But, we're going to throw it up in the air and actually not insist upon people applying for those grants under those rubrics to open it up. So I'm, in terms of, I should have at my fingertips 1,000, not 1,000, at least 20 projects to describe what we're doing, but they're so heterogeneous that I really would ask you to look on the website to see the kinds of things that we've sponsored. And not all of them, correspond, or most of them probably don't correspond to what I'm talking about as our, what we're trying to achieve and demonstrate. It's because you can't really, everybody talks about herding cats. You can't ask artists, particularly when you've only got $100,000 to do this kind of work exclusively, when the sources for funding and support are so limited. And in fact, UCIRA, whilst it's a big name institution and has all this coverage across 9 campuses, $100,000 is nothing. You go to UCLA, they've got much more than that on site. Probably Irvine does. Berkeley certainly does. UC Santa Cruz does. They have more money from the dean for their own art projects without having to come to us. So we're having to think about what can we do with this $100,000 that is going to be really effective. And the conference, I think, is one of the things, is our main advocacy tool. Because what we're demonstrating is a different way of doing knowledge, in a way, a different way of sharing knowledge, a different way of presenting art, where I'm thinking about art as research, where you actually encounter work and the people who make it, rather than talk about it, interpret it, try to understand what the artist's intention was. You're more like living inside it. So that, and I think the demonstration projects, this idea of demonstration is one thing that we're pushing over because demonstration can refer to visual and performing arts. The idea that you demonstrate what art can do, that perhaps people hadn't thought it could do, in terms of provoking thought, if not generating knowledge. So, the container project is very important, and it's one for us because it kind of, it fleshes out what we're trying to do. On the other hand, with our limited resources and influence, we can't necessarily generalize that across the whole system. So it is kind of discriminate and filtered, and in a sense, we're advocating, we're selectively appropriating certain projects and trying to turn those into exemplary projects.
Okay, can I have my quick question then? I've got 2 actually, but I'll just do the quick crass one, which is does size matter? I've been working in arts. I'm in the University of the Arts in London for the last year, and the thing that preoccupies a lot of the people I've been working with is how do we do art education in an age of mass kind of higher education? And a lot of the things that you were describing are, interdisciplinarity, even the process of critique. It's incredibly labour intensive. Mm-hmm. It works very well with kind of small numbers, but when you start applying it to large numbers, it seems to be much more problematic. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about that. I mean, I like your church idea, but you also said it was like a church, and if people came in, you had to find a way of educating them. So there seems to me to be a tension between that in some ways, between what you're describing as, and this idea of people just wander in.
Right.
You have to find some way of educating.
But I mean, I've got such limited examples. It's pathetic, and a lot of them anecdotal and personal.
That's
but, I was teaching a film and a class for Film and Media Studies Department a number of years ago on experimental film. Connie's teaches a class under normal circumstances. I got to teach it once, and so we're just dealing with a lot of undergraduates, a couple of hundred undergraduates, and we had an intense immersion in experimental film, which included not just avant-garde film, but art film, advertisements, all kinds of stuff. Typical cultural studies, mélange that but quite intensive, because I mean the film and media studies have the most punishing teaching schedule I've ever encountered in my life. Every class they seem to meet like 3 times a week for about 6 hours, and they show films and they discuss films, and so it was a pretty terrifying kind of commitment on my side too. But the students, so the first 6 weeks of the maybe 5 weeks of the class was just bombarding students with just getting them to keep notebooks and write essays and so on. But the main thing was to produce a piece that responded to all this, at the end of the day, and they could work collectively or in individual groups, and they would come in office hours and meet with me, and most of them did. And then, there'd be a whole set of screenings for 300 students or whatever. It takes a long time to do that. And the pieces had to be like 5 to 10 minutes long. But this was an opportunity. All these kids know how to use Photoshop or have performance aspirations or want to do spoken word so there was absolutely no really conditions that I put on the production, as long as they stood up in front of something and presented it in front of 300 people. So that's a way of kind of mass manufacturing a response to materials, rather than getting students to feel they have to master materials by going on the internet and plagiarizing an article or something. And so I wouldn't say, I mean, as usual, some of it was mediocre, a lot of it was sort of mediocre, but a lot of it wasn't. And all of it required a kind of personal investment and a sort of a struggle with the potential of complete implosion and failure, and an exposure to ridicule and the vulnerability involved in that. I think it's really character forming. It's really important for students to have to do that as undergraduates. So I think it can work, and it can be translated into cultural studies. I mean, in cultural and media studies, there's a practical component, and that's the kind of thing that I would hope could be done at Riverside in cultural studies, getting students. It's not just art students.
Fine art production,
Sorry?
Can it be translated into fine art production?
Well, in an undergraduate context, I don't think it's going to be that different from what I've just described. A lot of the time. I mean, you're dealing with big classes. Not all the kids, not in a public art school who sign on for, foundation art aren't going to be great artists. So, I don't think the quality issue counts at that level. I think it's more, how do you, entice, seduce, and invite, and students to think creatively and critically and take responsibility for it. That's really the issue for me. So tea and coffee and cake.